Listen. Listen to him speak.
We're all living lives that have been knocked out of order by trauma or loss, and that's really what my project is all about. It's trying to find a way of allowing the viewer to enter into that and uncover something maybe that's very real and human at its heart.
So that guy that was just there is Atom Egoyan, and I admire him so much because he constantly talks about that aspect of discovering something that is very real and uncovering something that is human at its heart. But what does all this really mean? What are we supposed to discover? Maybe he wants us to undergo some sort of intellectual and emotional transformation. Egoyan is interested in questions of discovery, whether it be cultural, social, political, and in doing so, he aims to impact audiences through his cultural products, transforming ideology and creating insights. But how does he do so through the filmic space, which then extends onto the audience? This audiovisual essay will first explore how Calendar creates a filmic third space of the Armenian diasporic identity, where negotiations and articulations of identity take place through the staging in depth and mise-en-scène. Then the audiovisual essay will move on to demonstrate how the aforementioned techniques can have a transformational potential, the potential to impact and transform audiences watching the film. To start off, Egoyan presents various manifestations of Armenianness in his film and therefore coalesces these different perspectives through a singular spatio-temporal entity. He presents the in-between spaces that dominate the heterogeneity of the Armenian diasporic identity. This is evident in Calendar, as the film features three main protagonists: a photographer, played by Atom Egoyan himself, a translator, who is the photographer's wife in the film, played by Arsene Khanjan, and the guide/driver, played by Ashot Adamian. The photographer and his wife, who are from the Western Armenian diaspora, meaning the diaspora that migrated to the West due to the Armenian genocide, travel to Armenia to take pictures of Armenian churches and temples for a commissioned calendar. As the narrative unravels, the translator and the photographer's relationship deteriorates due to the increasingly intimate relationship the translator has with the driver. Most of the scenes that involve taking photos of the Armenian churches and temples in the film are internally focalized objective point of view shots, as the shots are from the perspective of the photographer's camera and thus his viewpoint. These internally focalized objective shots feature centralized long shots of the Armenian churches and temples with the Armenian highlands in the background. In the foreground, Egoyan places the driver, who also acts as a guide that explains the history of the churches and temples in Armenian, and his wife, the translator, who translates the information from Armenian to English to the photographer. Egoyan is placed behind the camera and is not visible on the screen. There are thus certain layers due to the positioning of characters and the churches within these shots that correspond to differences within the Armenian and Western Armenian diasporic identity. For Ashot, who is an Armenian living in Armenia and is a national and citizen of the country that probably feels a strong connection towards Armenia just after the establishment of the Armenian nation, these churches and temples that signify the homeland are closest to him. He feels the most connected to these signifiers of the Armenian homeland and construes them as elements that construct his Armenian identity. He is usually placed closest to these churches and temples, farthest away from the camera. For him, these signifiers aren't necessarily symbolic constructs, but are naturally occurring signifiers. Thus, the driver represents the full-fledged and native Armenian, who knows the history of these churches and temples by heart. He represents the one whose identity is strictly defined within the confines of nationhood. He is closest to the pure essence of Armenianness, both physically and metaphorically, and thus he constitutes the first layer of being closest to pure Armenianness. To put it another way, his identity is static and fixed, as his identity is merely Armenian. There isn't much more space for his identity to fluctuate. His identity is absolute and unadulterated. Okay, let's put her back in there. The translator, who stands closer to the camera, represents the second layer of the Armenian identity. She does speak Armenian and is highly intrigued by the history of her homeland. By being drawn to the two men, being a translator, and being bilingual and accented, she is literally and figuratively in between the space of the driver and the photographer. She is in a state of limbo throughout the film, where on the one hand, she wants to immerse herself in the nativist tradition, and on the other hand, she is still attached to her husband. Even the fact that her role as a translator and interpreter bridges the gap between the two extreme positions within the Armenian identity, the driver who represents the pure Armenian and the photographer who represents the pseudo-Armenian. She herself talks Western Armenian, which is the language spoken by the Armenians in the Western diaspora. Through her accent and bilingualism, which primarily marks her as a diasporian, she is also in between the two ultimate positions of the Armenian identity, in between the driver who has a native accent and the photographer who does not speak any Armenian at all. She acts as an intermediator between the two, articulating their positions and differences due to her bilingualism. For example, in this scene where the driver asks the photographer if it has never occurred to him to touch and caress the churches. The photographer indulges in a satirical laugh and deems the driver's statement as meaningless.
Don't you feel the need to come closer, feel, like actually touch and feel?
Touch and feel the
Realize
churches?
how it's made, constructed?
To touch and feel the churches.
Yeah?
Hasn't occurred to me.
Hasn't occurred to you?
No.
Departing from these differences, the homeland for the translator is not a commodified object or means to make money, which is how the photographer perceives it, but it is an actualization of a heritage she never got to realistically experience. Arsine represents the Western Armenian Diasporic subject who is still deeply rooted within the Armenian tradition. The meaning of the homeland for Arsine lies within these symbolic spaces that are actualized and realized. They do not remain in the imaginary realm of desire, but she engages and even touches her heritage, and therefore comes closer to it. She represents the Western Armenian diasporian who speaks both Armenian and English and aspires to return to the idyllic homeland and Heimat, where utopian imagination becomes realistic objectivity. The last layer that remains is that is occupied by the photographer, who is foreignified to the whole space. Although not visually present in the frame, his presence is felt through the audible voice coming from off-screen space. This positioning would understand him as a distanced Western Armenian diasporian whose homeland is constructed through the process of mediation, photography. This is accentuated when at one point he interrupts the translator and asks the driver and her to move out of the frame to take the perfect shot. This signifies that it is merely the photograph that is of uttermost importance to him in terms of the project and the construction of his version of the homeland. He doesn't want to hear the historical narratives as it might contaminate his version of the homeland. He makes them leave as they distort his conception of it. Thus, the primary focus on the photograph as a static freeze frame is meant to draw one into aesthetic contemplation. What these churches and temples just mean to him is their beauty, as he says,
I think that they were very, very beautiful places.
They remain within the realm of the image, within the realm of the imaginary. He is removed and unacknowledged by the physical space and vice versa. It just exists and is reproduced through the image. These cultural and religious symbols are never actually actualized for the photographer, as he remains and watches from a distance. The homeland for the photographer is thus attributed meaning by remaining somewhat foreign, a figurative fetish. This is the only way to keep the homeland in the realm of desire, by keeping it at a distance. This is precisely why he constructs condensed versions of the homeland, as he deems it as tactilely undesirable. As Nafisi puts it, only when the grand return to the homeland is found to be impossible, illusory, or undesirable does the postmodernist semiosis set in. Then the nostalgia of the referent and the pain of separation from it may be transformed into a nostalgia for its synecdoches, fetishes, and signifieds, the frozen sounds and images of the homeland which are then circulated in exilic media and pop culture. However, the homeland does not always stay within the realm of the image throughout the film. The photographer at one point does get closer to his homeland, both physically and spiritually. Remember when he was asked if he ever has the urge to touch the churches? So yeah, after that, he is seen pointing to the facade of one of the churches, but he doesn't physically touch it. Again, he just comes closer to it from a distance. He thus attempts to reenact the spirituality that the driver possesses, but still remains aloof, just like in the rest of the similar scenes. The photographer's character thus becomes somewhat partially transformed as he integrates a trace of the nativist driver into his actions. This once again manifests the flexibility of the diasporic identity, where the subject is able to construct certain parts of their identity and even come to deconstruct it. The photographer brings himself closer to the other Armenian positions, but he might also distance himself at any other time and position himself elsewhere. Although the photographer, the driver, and the translator are spatially distant and distinguished, Egoyan places and merges these three different positions within a spatio-temporal whole, the film and the frame. Henceforth, the film presents the third space of Armenianness, where each subject constitutes the homeland as such. This whole construction of varied layers understands the Armenian diasporic identity, Armenianness, and the Western Armenian diasporic identity as heterogeneous, as a space where different identifications are simultaneously threaded and negotiated together. Calendar does not reveal the essence of Armenian culture or what we traditionally identify as Armenian, but it problematizes and questions what being Armenian is and how it manifests itself. Significations of the homeland are thus always in flux as characters perceive, craft, and shape cultural signs differently. The deep staging on the one hand accentuates on these differences, and on the other, harmonizes them. This exemplifies how film can become a negotiable space where identities are constructed, reconstructed, and deconstructed vis-a-vis diasporic cinema. The Armenian homeland thus becomes a heterotopia, where identities and differences within the Armenian diasporic subject are reconciled and exist within multifaceted and various spatiotemporal realms. There isn't one utopian imaginary homeland, but what the real actually encompasses is the heterotopic filmic space, in which, as Michel Foucault puts it, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. So how does all of this attempt to create some sort of transformation within you? As you might have noticed, there is something odd about the setup of the camera that you often don't see in the traditional Hollywood film. It directly addresses you. Egoyan's film breaks the barrier of the diegetic world by placing the camera right in front of the unraveling narrative, a location that requires the audience to be directly addressed, much like the photographer's position itself. Talking to the audience, albeit intentionally or not, is called the breaking the fourth wall technique. The breaking the fourth wall technique, in conjunction with the long take within these shots, not only emphasizes the photographer's ambivalence as both an active participator and producer and a passive observer, but it also does so to the viewer. The questions that are posed at him are clearly marked by sociocultural signification.
So do you want to come along with us? We're taking just a walk. Feel the need to come closer. Feel like actually touch and feel.
Well, I better stay here. I mean, the camera's here, it's all set up. To touch and feel the churches.
Concurrently, we are placed within Egoyan's optic and perspective and also become a recipient of the questions. In doing so, Egoyan highlights what the diasporic condition entails, an ongoing reflective process of one's spaces of social-cultural belonging, a reflection into one's identity and roots, and into the process of becoming. You are thus put within the diasporic space of ambivalence as the film breaks the fourth wall, which instigates a process of instantiation. The filmic space is extended onto ours and accentuates on the presentness of watching the film, all for the sake of our sociocultural journey, emphasizing that you indeed have the imaginative agency to dictate your identity construction. Breaking the fourth wall breaks that barrier between the diegetic world and the audience, allowing the constructiveness of the film to be unveiled. When the film is contained within its borders, it causes the audience to remain in the suspension of disbelief. However, once they are addressed, they come to comprehend that it is a constructed sphere where diegetic characters can also interact with the audience. The film therefore reflects upon itself as an ideological and narrational construction that probes the audience to ponder about their identity.